You might hate him. You might despise him. You might even feel disgusted. But there is one thing you will never forget after hearing this story: the smell of Henry VIII as he decayed. This is not a metaphor. This is not a folktale exaggerated by time. This is recorded history written down by people who were there, who saw it, who smelled it, and who could never forget it. When the king, who was once hailed as the most handsome prince in all of Europe, died, his body was so massive, it required a custom-built lead coffin. And despite being embalmed with every herb and spice, the court physicians could find fluid still seeped from within that casket, trailing across the chapel floor. And then, as night fell at Sion Abbey, the temporary stop on the royal funeral route, a stray dog wandered in and began to lick the royal ooze dripping from the broken coffin of a decaying monarch. The witnesses recoiled, remembering an old forgotten prophecy, a priest's warning that one day dogs would lick Henry's blood, just as they had licked the blood of King Ahab in the Bible. As punishment from God for a tyrant's sins, a king who beheaded wives, murdered friends, and made even the church tremble. But how did Henry VIII, a man who once stood atop the pinnacle of power, possessing everything a king could ever want: beauty, brilliance, strength, charm, wealth, women, and a crown? How did he end his life in such grotesque and humiliating fashion? How did the golden-haired, broad-shouldered, steel-thighed prince with an angelic face become a mound of festering flesh, weighing more than 400 pounds, unable to stand without ropes and pulleys, emitting a stench so foul that courtiers gagged when passing his chambers? How did the warrior who dazzled on horseback and debated philosophy become a paranoid killer who sent lovers and loyal servants alike to the block, and finally died wide-eyed, gasping, haunted by the names of women he had once exalted and then condemned? It all began on a seemingly ordinary day in January when Henry was 44 years old. He rode into a joust, as he had done countless times before, fully armored, confident, powerful. But this time, his horse stumbled, and the towering king was crushed under the weight of beast and iron, unconscious for 2 hours. He awoke with more than just broken flesh. The wound in his leg refused to heal, becoming a chronic ulcer that would fester for the rest of his life. O zinc pus, attracting flies, and permeating every palace with the smell of rot. But worse than the wound in his leg was what may have cracked inside his skull. Henry changed. He became volatile, impulsive, increasingly paranoid. Just a few months later, he ordered the execution of Anne Boleyn, his second wife, accusing her of adultery and incest. The charges were likely fabricated. The truth didn't matter anymore. A sword from France took her head on a cold May morning, and the Golden Prince began his descent into shadows. From then on, Henry ate like a general preparing for war, though he never rode into battle again. Mate pies, roasted birds, tankards of ale and wine, no vegetables, no fruit. His waistline exploded. His legs swelled. The ulcers worsened. Court physicians, clueless and cruel, have tried every gruesome method they knew: searing hot irons, poisonous ointments made of mercury and arsenic, bloodletting, and crude surgeries that did nothing but magnify the agony. Henry grew larger, more immobile, and more dangerous. By the time he was 50, he was barely human. He was a living corpse with absolute power, a tyrant wrapped in rotting flesh. Servants held their breath as they approached. One wrong look, one wrinkle of the nose at his stench, could lead to execution. He ordered the death of his most trusted advisor, Thomas Cromwell. He sentenced his fifth wife, Catherine Howard, barely 19, to death for supposed infidelity. He became obsessed with betrayal, convinced that his food was poisoned, that conspirators whispered in every shadow. Every dish was tasted by multiple servants, every goblet examined, every bite a calculated risk. And then came the end. On the 28th of January, in the year 1547, Henry VIII died, but not peacefully. He was delirious, fevered, calling out names of the dead: Jane Seymour, Anne Boleyn. His body, ravaged by disease and infection, shut down organ by organ. His breath slowed, his words failed, and still, no one dared say the king was dying, because to speak such truth was treason. Only when death came did Archbishop Thomas Cranmer rush to his side, and when asked if he died a Christian, Henry squeezed his hand once. That was his final conscious act. But death did not end the horror. His bloated corpse had to be embalmed, wrapped, sealed inside a lead coffin, and then placed within a wooden one. The journey to Windsor began. Along the way, the procession stopped at Sion Abbey, ironically, the very place Henry had once desecrated during the Reformation, and where his fifth wife had been imprisoned before execution. That night, something went wrong. The coffin cracked, fluid leaked, and when dawn came, a dog was seen licking the mess on the chapel floor. Witnesses remembered the prophecy. Whispers spread. The king, who mocked God, now seemed to fulfill divine judgment. And when he finally reached Windsor Castle, the damage continued. The coffin had to be repaired. Years later, in 1813, when workers accidentally opened his tomb, they found Henry's lead coffin torn, burst open in the middle. The remains were visible bones, beard, fragments of flesh. Jane Seymour's coffin beside his was perfectly intact. Historians believe the king's body had exploded from the buildup of gases, rupturing the lead itself. And that is perhaps the most fitting image of all. A man who could command armies, bend church and law to his will, burn monasteries, rewrite marriages, kill wives, and crown himself supreme, yet in the end, he could not conquer his own decay. He could not prevent his flesh from rotting. He could not keep his corpse from bursting open. This was the death of Henry VIII, and this is only the beginning of the story. There was a time when Henry VIII believed himself invincible. He rode through the court like a golden god, towering above his courtiers, his hair shining like fire under the candlelight of Westminster, his voice echoing down stone corridors with the confidence of a man who had never tasted failure and never seen the end of glory. He was not just a king, he was a spectacle, 6 feet and 2 inches tall, when most men barely reached his shoulder, legs sculpted by hours on horseback, hands calloused from the hunt, and a gaze so piercing that even seasoned ambassadors found themselves shrinking before him. He did not walk into a room. He conquered it, and when he rode into tournaments in full armor, the crowd roared not merely for a monarch, but for a warrior king, a Renaissance lion who could wield both sword and scripture with equal flair. He had everything: youth, beauty, strength, and above all, the terrifying knowledge that nothing could stop him. Until the day the horse fell. It was the 24th of January, in the year 1536. A Tuesday, Greenwich Palace shimmered under a winter sun, and the royal court had gathered once again to watch their king joust, to cheer as he thundered down the tilt yard, his lance raised, his steed defiant. the very embodiment of royal power in motion. Henry, then aged 44, was not a young man, by Tudor standards, but he had never stopped believing in the legend of himself. He still wore his armor with pride, and still mounted his charger with the ease of a man half his age. This was no ceremonial display. Henry rode to fight, to win, to dominate, and the crowd, as always, expected nothing less. But then the horse stumbled. Perhaps it was a stone on the tilt yard. Perhaps the beast's leg gave way. Or perhaps fate, bored with Henry's endless victories. I decided it was time for a different story to begin. Whatever the cause, it happened in an instant. The animal lurched. Henry lost balance, and then the mighty king, encased in full armor, weighing hundreds of pounds, was thrown violently to the ground. The horse collapsed atop him. Metal crushed into earth. The ground shook. And for the first time in years, the court did not cheer. It screamed. He did not rise. Not at first, for 2 full hours. The most powerful man in England lay unconscious in the dirt. His helmet dented. His limbs twisted beneath him. His courtiers gathered in silent horror, terrified not just for his life but for their own. Because if Henry died that day, everything would unravel. The church, already torn apart by his break from Rome. The succession, still unstable with only a daughter, Mary, and no male heir. The nobility, divided between old families and new upstarts, and beneath it all, the ticking clock of fate whispering that kings were still mortal, that empires, like bones, it could break in an instant. But Henry did not die. He awoke, and England, for a moment, breathed again. But something was different. Beneath the surface of that miraculous survival lay the roots of a transformation so slow, so insidious, that no one could name it until it was far too late. His leg, the right one, had taken the worst of the impact, a wound deep and jagged, the kind that even modern medicine would struggle to manage, let alone the crude ministrations of 16th century surgeons. They stitched it, wrapped it, assured him it would heal. It did not. Days passed, then weeks, and the wound remained stubborn, swollen, angry. Then the odor began, faint at first, a whisper of infection. But it grew. As the wound refused to close, as the flesh turned on itself, decaying while still attached to a living man. The court physicians, men of science and superstition, applied hot irons, hoping to burn away the corruption. They smeared on ointments laced with mercury and arsenic, believing poison could draw out poison. They bled him. They drained him. They prayed. Nothing worked. And through it all, the king endured, but not unchanged. The pain never left him. It throbbed through his body, day and night. A constant, gnawing reminder that he was no longer whole. He began to limp. He rode less, walked less, sat more. His temper shortened. His patience, once the hallmark of a statesman, became brittle. Every ache became an enemy. Every whisper became a threat. And somewhere deep in the twisted pathways of his skull, something began to shift. Modern doctors, studying the old records. I believe Henry suffered a traumatic brain injury during that fall. The kind that warps personality, that inflames paranoia, that strips away restraint and replaces it with fury. And so the golden prince who once charmed Europe began to fade, replaced by a man no longer ruled by reason, but by pain. Suspicion. and an ever-growing need to dominate what he could no longer physically control. In the years that followed, the consequences rippled outward like poison in a well. Anne Boleyn, his second wife, it was executed less than 4 months later. Was it a coincidence? Some historians say no, that the Henry who returned from that fall was not the same man who had loved Anne with such reckless passion, that the wound infected more than just his leg, it infected his heart. The trials that followed were grotesque in their invention. Accusations of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother. Charges so outlandish that even now they spark fierce debate. But Henry believed them, or claimed to, and when the sword fell at Tower Green, a part of Henry fell with it. The part that loved, the part that trusted, the part that still hoped for redemption. He married again, and again, and again, each time chasing something lost, each time finding only disappointment. His body grew heavier. The ulcer on his leg became permanent. A foul, oozing crater that bled through bandages and soaked his bedding. His appetite, once heroic, became monstrous. He consumed 5,000 calories a day, mostly meats and wine, fueling a body that could no longer burn what it took in. His waist expanded past 50 inches. His movements slowed. His breath came short. And the smell, oh the smell, became legend. Courtiers gagged in his presence, but dared not show it. Palace architects widened doorways, installed winches to lift him from bed. Servants dressed and undressed him, wiped his sores, carried his weight. Yet still, they called him Your Majesty. Still, they bowed, because to displease the king was death, because the mask of divine authority still clung to him, even as his flesh rotted and his mind unraveled. But the most terrifying part was this: Henry knew. He knew his body was betraying him. He knew his soul was changing. And he hated it. Hated the weakness. Hated the loss of control. I hated the whisper that he was no longer feared but pitied. And in that hatred, he struck out against wives, against advisors, against old friends. The man who once embodied the hope of a nation became its darkest nightmare. All because of one fall, one horse, one ordinary day turned catastrophic. And so this is where we find him in the middle of his reign, neither fully king nor fully man, trapped in a body that hurt with every breath, trapped in a mind that no longer knew where truth ended and delusion began, a monarch cursed not by fate, but by the very illusion that he could not fall. And when he did, the echo of that fall never stopped ringing, not through his body, not through his court, and not through the blood-stained pages of history, because this was the beginning of the end, and the end, as we now know, would be more grotesque, more tragic, and more unforgettable than anyone could imagine. There are wounds that heal, and then there are wounds that stay open not just on the body, but in the life that follows. Henry VIII's leg injury was never just a scar or a sore. It was an open door through which pain entered and never left. Long after the jousting accident that cracked his body and shook his brain, the gash on his right thigh remained as a quiet, festering reminder that even a king could be broken by a single fall. But this was no ordinary wound. It became a chasm, deepening with time, oozing with infection, stinking of death long before death came. And around that wound, Henry's life began to collapse, not with screams or banners, but with small, grinding humiliations that no crown could conceal. At first, he tried to hide it. He continued to ride when he could, though the saddle bit deeper into him with every motion. He still appeared at court in richly embroidered hose, layers of silk and velvet, hiding the bandages wrapped beneath. But those closest to him saw the truth. They smelled it before they saw it. The wound leaked. At times, it bled through the wrappings. At others, it released pus that clung to his clothing and the bed linens in yellow streaks. The king's physicians changed the dressings daily, then twice daily, then more. But no matter how much they cleaned, how much they pressed herbs or ointments into the raw, angry flesh, the sore refused to close. It remained there, like an eye, always open, always watching. The king's patience, once his proudest tool, began to erode. At first, he was irritable, then unpredictable, then cruel, because nothing eats at the soul like constant pain, and nothing twists the mind like the knowledge that the pain will never go away. He slept poorly, woke in rages, and lost interest in the things he once loved: riding prom, composing music, theological debates. All of it faded beneath the thrum of infection, the low fever that gripped his body like a second skin. But Henry would not surrender. If his leg betrayed him, he would fight with his appetite. He would feast like the lion he once was. Perhaps, in eating, in drinking, in excess, he could still feel strong. Perhaps he believed that consumption was power, that swallowing enough food, enough meat, enough wine, might quiet the pain. And so he began to eat more, not out of hunger, but out of defiance. The royal kitchens documented meals that bordered on grotesque: entire roast swans, fattened geese, pies stuffed with spiced venison, glazed hams dripping with lard, rivers of red wine, goblets of dark ale, trenchers of cheese and sugared fruits, and always meat: lamb, boar, rabbit, capon, not just once a day, but all through the day. Snacks between meals, midnight platters, indulgences delivered to his chambers, even as he sat propped up by pillows, legs bandaged, his body groaning under its own weight. He consumed upwards of 5,000 calories daily, sometimes far more. And yet, there were no greens, no leafy herbs, no clean foods to aid digestion or reduce inflammation. He scoffed at vegetables. In the Tudor court, greens were for the poor, meat was for kings. But his body, no longer the athletic marvel of his youth, could not burn what he fed it, and so it stored it first in the belly, then in the chest, then in the face and neck, until the once slender prince with the angelic face became swollen, bloated, almost unrecognizable. His waistline expanded past 50 inches. His weight crossed into 400 pounds. His legs grew so swollen that cloth could not cling to them. Tailors began altering the shape of his clothing, designing garments not to flatter, but to disguise. Eventually, even disguise became impossible. The king could not walk unaided. Servants were required to help him from his bed, sometimes hoisting him with straps and pulleys designed for cargo. Not men. The palace floors were reinforced. The doorways widened. Thrones adjusted. All of England bent around the ever-growing mass of one decaying body. And still, the wound remained. Now, the infection had spread to the other leg. Two sores. Weeping. Stinking. Visible through the layers of linen and silk that failed to contain them. Courtiers began to carry scented handkerchiefs, lavender, rosewater, clove oil. They pressed them to their noses when entering the king's chambers. But even then, the stench bled through. It hung in the air like a curse. Some said you could smell him from 3 rooms away. Others claimed the odor clung to your clothes after a single audience. But no one dared speak it aloud. Because one wrinkle of the nose, one look of disgust, and your head could fall. This was the paradox of Henry's later years. A king, no one dared displease, and yet no one could bear to be near. And what of his doctors? They tried. In their own brutal, medieval way, they cauterized the wounds, burning them with red-hot metal. Believing the fire would kill what the knife could not have, they mixed salves from ground emeralds, honey, even powdered bone. They applied poultices so thick and foul that servants gagged while preparing them. They administered bleeding rituals, opening veins with sharp knives and letting the blood flow into silver bowls. They believed that too much black bile or choler caused imbalance in the body, and that balance could only be restored through release. But all they did was weaken him. The ulcers festered. His strength waned. And worse, his mind began to slip. The pain made him cruel. Yes, but it also made him afraid. Every twinge in his chest became a sign of death. Every meal, a potential poison. He trusted no one. Not his physicians. Not his cooks. Not even his wives. Paranoia, like the infection, took root in his blood. He began insisting that every dish be tasted multiple times by multiple servants. Each cup, each knife, each plate inspected, wiped, tested, and blessed before it came to his mouth. And yet, despite all these precautions, he ate more, and more, and more, as though trying to bury the fear beneath the weight of indulgence. This spiral, this endless loop of pain. Consumption. Decay became Henry's reality. A body too large to carry. Legs too wounded to walk. A stomach that never knew satisfaction. A mind that never knew peace. The athletic prince had become a bedridden king. The shining face of England had become a grotesque shadow of itself. And all the while, the ulcer remained. There is a particular cruelty in wounds that do not heal, because they remind you every moment that you are still mortal, that your body, no matter how royal, obeys the same laws as every other. Henry VIII was once worshipped as a symbol of divine authority. But his body now screamed what his courtiers dared not whisper, that even kings rot, that even power cannot stop the creeping hand of death, that even the most glorious bodies, if not broken by battle, will one day be broken by time, by indulgence, by arrogance, by the refusal to acknowledge limits. And as the years dragged on, Henry did not acknowledge. He refused. He clung to the myth of himself, even as his body decomposed. He commissioned portraits that flattered his figure, hiding his bulk behind wide skirts and furs. He banned artists from painting him full length. He spoke of wars he could no longer fight, of rides he could no longer take, of sons he longed for, but would never see grow into men. His court played along. They had no choice, because as his body decayed, his temper sharpened, his suspicion deepened, his punishments grew swifter, more irrational, more final. He had become a man who could no longer move without help, but could still send others to their death with a whisper. And so they bowed. They cheered. They called him Majesty. Even as the air around him grew thick with the scent of rot, this was no longer just a king. This was a man being consumed day by day, inch by inch, by his own refusal to let go, by a wound that would not heal, by a hunger that could not be satisfied, by a fear that no crown could protect him from. And the worst part, the end was still far away. They used to say that Henry VIII had the sharpest mind in Christendom. He spoke Latin like a scholar, debated theology with bishops, wrote treatises that impressed even the Pope, and could charm a foreign ambassador before breakfast. His early reign had been built not just on strength and stature, but on brilliance, on quick wit, keen memory, and a voice that could cut through any argument like a blade. But all of that had begun to fade. Not in an instant, not in one dramatic collapse, but in the slow erosion of reason sanded away by years of pain. Swollen flesh, open wounds, and the creeping suspicion that everyone around him was waiting for his death. The court noticed it first, not in what he said, but in what he stopped saying. The long philosophical conversations became short, sharp orders. The debates gave way to accusations. The laughter that once echoed down the great halls of Hampton Court was replaced with silence. You could walk the entire length of the palace and not hear a single joke spoken above a whisper. Everyone was watching. Everyone was calculating. Because Henry was no longer predictable, the same man who called you brother one week might call for your execution the next. And often, no one saw it coming. Not even the condemned. It is one thing to serve a strong king, another to serve a sick one. But to serve a king who is both sick and afraid, that is the most dangerous service of all. Henry had become obsessed with betrayal. He saw it everywhere, in the glances exchanged between courtiers, in the shifting alliances of noble families, in the unreadable faces of those who once pledged him their lives. To be silent was suspicious. To speak too freely was worse. To be invisible was wise. And so the court became a theater of masks, where every word was weighed, every nod rehearsed, and every smile forced. The men around him changed too. Gone were the old friends who had shared his youth, the ones who remembered when he could ride all day and dance all night. Most were dead, some by war, many by execution. In their place came younger, more cautious men, or those bold enough to flatter and careful enough to vanish. When the king's mood turned, the air was heavy with fear, not of invasion or famine, but of the king himself. Because Henry's paranoia did not just live in his mind, it radiated outward, like poison in water, infecting everyone it touched. He began to see plots in everything. A whispered conversation between two courtiers became a conspiracy. A delay in delivering his supper became potential sabotage. A physician's hesitation became treason. And once Henry had made up his mind, there was no unmaking it. No argument. No defense. No mercy. His word was final. His suspicion became fact. His fear became law. And death followed close behind. In the year 1540, he turned on the man who had served him most loyally, Thomas Cromwell, the brilliant, ruthless architect of Henry's break from Rome. For years, Cromwell had done the king's dirtiest work, dissolving monasteries, drafting laws, engineering marriages, arranging executions. He had climbed higher than any common-born man had ever dared. But now, he fell, accused of treason, accused of heresy, accused of overreaching ambition, accusations that came not from evidence but from Henry's growing unease. Cromwell was arrested, imprisoned, tried without fair process, and on the 28th of July, he was beheaded. Henry later called the execution a mistake, but by then, the blood had long dried. It was not the last. The axe had become as common as the crown in Henry's court. Every few months, another name disappeared from the rolls. Another family fell. Another head was removed. Some died for whispering the wrong word. Some died for marrying without permission. Some died simply because Henry changed his mind. It was said that fear gripped even the air itself at Whitehall, that servants stepped more quietly, that musicians played more softly, that even the candles seemed to burn with trembling light. And then came Catherine Howard. She was young, barely a woman, 19, when she married Henry, who by then was nearing 50. His body rotting, his legs wrapped in pus-soaked bandages, his eyes sunken and rimmed with pain. But to him, Catherine was a second chance at youth. She was lively, bright-eyed, quick with a laugh. He called her his rose without a thorn, and for a while, she played the role well, dancing when asked, smiling on cue, stroking the king's ego with the practiced grace of a girl raised in noble courts. But youth does not always understand danger. Or perhaps Catherine did understand, and simply refused to live in fear. Either way, she made a fatal mistake. Whether she was truly unfaithful, or merely guilty of past indiscretions, no longer matters. Rumors reached the king. Whispers about letters, about meetings, about another man. And once the suspicion took hold, it consumed him. Henry, already bloated with pain and fear, flew into a rage, unlike any he had known before. Witnesses said his screams echoed for hours. He tore at his clothes. He wept. He shook with fury. Then, he ordered the investigation. Catherine was arrested, imprisoned, interrogated, tortured not with blades, but with silence and isolation. She begged for mercy. She screamed that she wanted to live. She wrote desperate letters, pleading for Henry to remember her smiles, her dances, her love. But he would not read them. He would not see her again. On a cold day in February, in the year 1542, the young queen was led to the scaffold. She asked for forgiveness. She laid her head down, and she died. After that, something in Henry broke permanently. His mind, once brilliant, now fractured. He spoke less, trusted no one. Even his food became a source of fear. Every dish was tasted 3 times before it reached him. Multiple tasters, multiple gardes. Cooks were watched like criminals. Servants were questioned about the salt, the butter, the bread. He was convinced someone wanted him dead. And maybe they did. But it no longer mattered. Because Henry's mind could no longer tell the difference between real danger and imagined plots. Every shadow became a knife. Every silence became a whisper. Every kindness became a trap. Even those who loved him lived in fear. His 6th wife, Catherine Parr, walked a tightrope between nursing him and avoiding his wrath. She was clever, careful, measured. She read him scriptures, tended his sores, and spoke only when spoken to. She survived, but she saw what he had become. She watched the king crumble before her eyes, not in an explosion of madness, but in a slow unraveling, where the man she married seemed to vanish a little more each week. By the mid-40s, the court was no longer a place of splendor. It was a labyrinth of secrets. Ministers came and went like ghosts. The walls themselves seemed to lean inward, heavy with the weight of unspoken dread. And at the center of it all, Henry sat bloated, bandaged, breathless, his crown still on his head, but his kingdom shrinking with every hour. He was no longer ruling England. He was defending himself from it. And though he did not know it yet, the final reckoning was close. There comes a moment in every life when the body begins to betray its owner. For most, it comes slowly, a stiffness in the knees, a forgotten name, a tremor that wasn't there before. But for Henry VIII, the betrayal was neither subtle nor merciful. It arrived loudly, grotesquely, relentlessly, until there was no denying the truth that even the most powerful man in the kingdom had become a prisoner of his own flesh. By the time the king reached his late 40s, his legs had become two ulcerated columns of rot. His stomach spilled out in front of him like a siege weapon, and his breath came in short, wheezing bursts. He was no longer aging, he was collapsing. Gone were the days when Henry could ride through the fields with the wind tearing through his hair, when he leapt onto the tournament field like Mars himself, sword flashing, blood hot. The man who once danced with foreign princesses until sunrise, who wrestled courtiers for sport, who hunted stags on horseback and made love with the hunger of a conqueror, that man was gone. In his place was a figure so bloated, so immobile, so rank with infection, that even approaching him required physical and emotional preparation. Morning. The ceremony of rising, once known as the lever, a ritual of royal dignity, became a grotesque performance of ropes, grunts, sweat, and pain. The king no longer sat up in bed by his own strength. He had to be lifted, hoisted. Even servants wrapped canvas slings beneath him and pulled at pulleys fixed to the ceiling, not unlike the system used to move cargo in the shipyards at Portsmouth. His groans filled the chamber. Sometimes he cried out. Sometimes he cursed. The room had to be filled with strong men, grooms, pages, even cooks pressed into service to shift the king without tearing his skin or upsetting the festering sores on his legs, which still bled through their wrappings and soaked the sheets beneath him in the dark of every night. The bed itself had been custom built, reinforced to withstand not just the weight of a man, but the weight of a man and his pain. The mattress was thick, but no longer soft. It had to be firm enough to resist sagging, hard enough to stop the king from sinking so far that lifting him became impossible. Its linens were changed multiple times a day. Blood and pus stained them in wide, brown patches, and the smell was unmistakable, even with the windows open, even with rosemary burning in the corners and rosewater sprinkled on the floors. And the room, oh, the room, once a place of splendor, it now reeked of sickness. Tapestries hung heavy on the walls, but even the thickest wool could not absorb the odor. Courtiers entering the royal chambers pressed perfumed cloths to their faces. Some vomited in the corridors after leaving. A few simply refused to enter at all, claiming illness or duty elsewhere, knowing full well that their absence might cost them their lives. Because proximity to the king meant power, but it also meant danger. And increasingly, the danger wasn't just political. It was physical. It was the danger of breathing in the foul rot of a man who had become, in all but title, a living corpse. The palaces themselves changed to accommodate the monarch's body. At Whitehall, doorways were widened to allow him to pass without turning sideways. Thresholds were leveled to stop him from tripping over the smallest step. The floors of his private quarters were reinforced with additional beams, lest the weight of his footsteps crack the very wood beneath him. At Hampton Court, ramps were installed where stairs once stood, and in every palace, new chairs were commissioned wider, stordia, lined with furs, not for comfort, but to soak up the discharge from his sores. He could no longer bathe in a tub. The risk of infection, the danger of movement, the sheer logistical challenge of getting him into and out of a bath, it was all too much. Instead, Servants wiped him down with cloth soaked in vinegar and herbs. They scrubbed under the folds of his belly, beneath his arms, between his toes. But there was only so much they could do. The skin cracked. The ulcers wept. The gout in his feet swelled his toes to the size of plums. And his breath, once warm with wine and laughter, now came with the smell of rot, as if his insides were souring along with his flesh. He could not walk more than a few steps without assistance. A special chair was devised, a kind of portable throne, borne by 4 strong men, padded like a cradle, with leather straps to keep the king upright. They carried him through the halls as one might carry a statue, slow, careful, reverent, and all the while, Henry glared at those who watched him pass, daring them to comment, daring them to smirk, daring them to see the truth. He refused to say aloud that he was no longer truly king of anything, except the space his body occupied, and the fear it inspired. And yet he ruled. He still ruled. From his bed, from his chair, from the rooms that smelled like death and echoed with his labored breath. Henry signed decrees. He issued executions. He dictated policy and sent men to war. But the cost of every command was another inch lost from his dignity. His voice grew hoarse. His memory faltered. He forgot names. He mistook courtiers for ghosts of the past. He raged when servants hesitated, then begged them to stay when they bowed to leave. He was falling apart, cell by cell, thought by thought. But no one dared look directly at the collapse, because even now, the old terror remained. If the king saw pity in your eyes, he might accuse you of treason. If he caught you glancing at the bandage on his leg, he might suspect you of whispering. If you spoke too kindly, he might think you were mocking him. The line between favor and death was as thin as the linen wrapping his sores, and the food, always the food, still brought in daily on silver platters, is still paraded as if the king were to dine with glory. But now the rituals were stricter, the fear sharper. Every dish was inspected by a rotating chain of servants. Each bite was tasted not once, but twice, sometimes 3 times, by men chosen carefully and changed often. Poison, real or imagined, haunted every meal. And yet he ate, not out of hunger, but out of habit, out of loneliness, out of the desperate hope that fullness might drown out the emptiness inside. He chewed slowly now. His teeth were blackened. His gums bled. But the meals continued. Roast goose, honeyed pears, maethpias, beef stews, and gallons of wine, dark and rich, pungent, pouring into a stomach already stretched beyond reason. And when he was done, he sat for hours, staring, sometimes muttering, sometimes smiling at things no one else could see. By the time he turned 50, there were days when he did not rise at all. Days when even the pulley system could not lift him. Days when he lay in a fog, dreaming of youth, of Anne's laughter, of Jane's smile, of tournaments and music and summers before the pain. On those days, the court held its breath. The doors to the chamber remained closed. The kingdom waited, because they never knew if Henry would emerge from that room as a king or as a corpse. He was not dying yet. Not officially. No one could say such a thing aloud. To predict the death of the king was to commit treason. But everyone knew. They saw it in the blood on his sheets, smelled it in the air that clung to his skin, heard it in the gaps between his words. He was being consumed, slowly, publicly, without dignity, and worst of all, without rest. Because there are worse things than death. There is waiting for it in agony. While the world continues to bow before your throne, and you can no longer stand to greet it, there are moments in life that stretch out far longer than time, allows moments when each breath seems like the last, but somehow it isn't. And so it was in the final days of Henry VIII, his body, already a battlefield of rot and swelling, had reached the limits of its suffering. The ulcers had deepened into blackened wounds. The leg that once spurred horses to flight was now little more than a pillar of gangrene and pus. And yet, he breathed. Still king. Still feared. Still alive. Though only just. It was winter, the kind of bitter, creeping English cold that seeps into the bones and refuses to leave. Outside the palace at Whitehall, the River Thames moved sluggishly, coated in patches of ice, its banks silent beneath a blanket of frost. Inside, in the royal bedchamber, the fire burned hot and constant, but it could not warm. The dying man stretched across the massive bed. Not even heat could reach through the stink of decay that filled the chamber now, no longer masked by lavender or rosewater or cloves. The stench had triumphed. It hung in the curtains. It soaked into the tapestries. It lived in the very stones. Henry lay still for hours at a time. His chest rose and fell in shallow waves. His eyes half-lidded, glassy, unfocused. Sometimes he muttered. Sometimes he groaned. Sometimes he called out into the empty air, speaking to people no one else could see. The physicians stood nearby, silent and grim. They had exhausted every cure they knew. The wound in his leg had spread infection through his bloodstream. Septicemia. Blood poisoning. Nothing. They applied no poultice. No powder. No prayer could stop it now. The fever took hold quickly. One morning, his temperature spiked so high, his attendants feared his bed would catch fire from his skin. He thrashed, pulling at the sheets, kicking what strength remained in his swollen legs, screaming without words. And then, just as suddenly, he felt cold. His skin turned ashen. His breath grew ragged. They wrapped him in more blankets. They stoked the fire, but the heat would not return. And through it all, he spoke names. Jane, Anne, George, Thomas. Voices from his past, called forth by pain or guilt, or some shadow of memory that still flickered in his failing mind. One day he cried out for Jane Seymour, his third wife, the one who had died giving him the son he so desperately wanted. His voice softened when he said her name. A smile almost touched his lips. Another time, he whispered Anne Boleyn, not in rage, not in hatred, but as if remembering a song long forgotten. Some claimed he wept. Others claimed he begged. No one knew what visions danced behind his eyelids, what ghosts visited the man who had sent so many others to their deaths. The fever made him wander not in body, but in memory. He believed he was young again. He asked for his horse, for his armor. He called out for music. Then, just as quickly, he would grow still and mutter threats. Warning, enemies no longer living. Issuing orders to guards no longer present. At one point, he demanded that Cromwell be arrested again, forgetting that he had already beheaded him years before. Another time, he asked for his mother. By now, no one in the court doubted that he was dying. The evidence was undeniable. His skin had turned a waxy yellow. His breathing came in hiccuped gasps. His eyes, once sharp and calculating, now rolled back in his head as he drifted between consciousness and hallucination. But still no one dared say it aloud, because under English law, To speak of the king's death before it happened was treason. Even if he was gasping, even if he could no longer speak, even if death sat beside him like a patient servant, waiting for the signal, you could not say it. You could not name it. And so the fiction continued. Physicians insisted he was resting. Courtiers whispered that he only needed time. Servants changed his linens in silence, even as they wrung out cloths soaked with black fluid. The Queen, Catherine Parr, stood vigil nearby. She did not weep. She did not pray aloud. She simply watched. She had seen this coming for years. The way his mind unraveled, the way his body swelled, the way his anger drowned everything it touched. She had prepared herself, as best anyone could, for the moment when the throne would be empty, and England would once again teeter on the edge of uncertainty. Finally, after weeks of pretense, someone had to act. They summoned Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, a man who had stood beside Henry in both triumph and terror, a man who knew the smell of power and the weight of its loss. Cranmer rode to Whitehall at once. When he entered the royal chamber, the air hit him like a blow. The fire was blazing. The windows were shut. But the odor, the unmistakable stench of death, wrapped around his throat like smoke. Henry did not speak. His tongue was too dry, his throat too swollen. Perhaps his brain could no longer form sentences. But when Cranmer leaned close and asked if he died in the faith, if he believed in Christ, if he died, a Christian, Henry's hand moved. Slowly, weakly, he reached out and squeezed. That was his final act. The room waited. No one moved. No one cried. And then silence. The morning of January the 28th, in the year 1547, the body of King Henry VIII ceased to breathe. He was 55 years old. He had reigned for 37 years. He had buried 5 wives and countless friends. He had broken the Catholic Church in England. He had rewritten the laws of marriage, of faith, and treason. He had made himself the center of a nation's soul, and then he had watched that soul fracture. But death, in the end, does not care for crowns. It takes kings as easily as it takes thieves. And in that quiet room, beneath velvet canopies and beside flickering firelight, death took the king who once believed himself too powerful to fall. Outside, London remained asleep. No bells rang. No cannons fired. The courtiers who stood in the room dared not move until someone else did, because even in death, Henry still ruled them in fear, in silence, in the memories of the heads he had taken, the lives he had ended, the orders he had given with a voice that now no longer stirred. But this was not the end. Not yet. Because what happened to the king's body, what happened in the days after, would become one of the most grotesque and whispered legends in all of English history. And if you listened closely that night, in the moments after the breath stopped, you might have heard it, not a sound from the chamber, but a sound from deep within the body that lay still. A swelling, a pressure, a whisper of something waiting to burst. They wrapped him in silence. In the hours after the breath left his body, the servants moved like ghosts. Their steps slow, their faces pale. No one spoke of grief. No one cried aloud. There was no time, because the moment the king died, 1,000 obligations came crashing into motion. The will had to be located, the heir informed, the palace secured, the body swollen, stinking, and filled with the gases of decay had to be prepared. And that preparation was no easy task. Henry VIII, at the time of his death, was no longer a man in any ordinary sense. He was over 400 pounds, his abdomen distended, his legs ulcerated and leaking, his skin bloated with infection, even in death. He overwhelmed the room. The servants who had once lifted him with pulleys now stood helpless. They called for more men, more cloth, more strength. The process took hours. Every roll of linen, every handful of herbs, every failed attempt to fit his enormous bulk into the death garments was a struggle between duty and revulsion. The embalmers removed his viscera, the organs inside that would rot the fastest. They filled the hollowed chest and stomach with spices, with dried flowers, with anything strong enough to mask the stench. They stitched the body closed, though not tightly enough. Then they wrapped him linen upon linen, soaked in resin, bound tight in layers that crackled as they dried. And finally, they lowered him into the first coffin wood, thick and carved to his shape. But it would not hold. Henry's size demanded something more. A second coffin was made of lead melted and shaped to encase the wooden one, sealing the king inside, not just from the world, but from the rot building inside his own body. The lead coffin was soldered shut, the wood placed inside, the body, now unseen, now silent, rested. But it did not sleep. Something inside it still moved, still waited, still changed. The plan was to take him to Windsor Castle, to the chapel of St. George, where he would lie beside Jane Seymour, the only wife he had loved in death more than in life. But the journey would take time. The procession, slow and ceremonial, would require nights of rest at sacred stops along the way. And the first of those stops, fatefully, poetically, horrifically, was Sion Abbey. The irony was sharp. Sion Abbey had once been a proud Catholic house, a place of holy vows and cloistered women, until Henry, in his rage against Rome, had ordered its destruction. The nuns had been expelled, the altars desecrated, the building stripped bare. But now, in the cold of February, in the year 1547, it welcomed him once more, not as a king, but as a corpse. The lead coffin was placed in what remained of the abbey's chapel. The roof was broken in places, the windows boarded. Cold air slithered through the cracks, biting at the heels of the guards posted to watch through the night. They stood near the coffin, some dozing, some murmuring, all keeping their distance from the box that now emitted a smell no cloth could conceal. The royal corpse could not be left alone. Protocol demanded it, but few wanted to be near it for long. And then, during the night, something happened. What exactly? No one can say for certain. The accounts differ. Some say it was the journey, the jostling of the carriage over frozen roads, the rocking back and forth of weight, too great for hinges and seams to bear. Others say the embalming had failed, that the gases inside the body had continued to build despite the sealing, that pressure was mounting. Still others suggest that nothing unusual happened, only time and biology and inevitability. But what all sources agree upon is this: in the early morning hours of February the 15th, the lead coffin was found leaking. Not dripping, not sweating, leaking. A dark, viscous fluid had emerged from a crack near the base, the lead seam having split under pressure. Forced open, not by sabotage, not by outside force, but by whatever had been growing, churning, expanding inside the body of the dead king. The fluid pooled beneath the coffin. It soaked into the cracks of the chapel floor. It spread slowly, silently, foully. And then came the dog. Some say it was a stray drawn in from the wild by the scent of blood and meat and death. Others say it was a guard dog, broken from its chain. But whoever it belonged to, whatever its name, the dog entered the chapel as dawn crept toward the windows, nose low to the ground, tongue flicking. It found the puddle, and it drank. Witnesses stood frozen, unsure whether to shout, to weep, or to flee. The scene before them was too surreal, too precise, too horrifying, because this was no ordinary accident. This was prophecy come alive. 15 years earlier, on Easter Sunday in the year 1532, a friar named William Pato had preached a daring sermon before the king himself. In it, he warned Henry that his sins, his castaway of Queen Catherine, his desire for Anne Boleyn, his war against Rome would bring divine punishment. He compared the king to the biblical Ahab, who was also led astray by a woman and died disgraced. His blood licked by dogs. The friar had been banished. The prophecy mocked. But now, here, in this ruined abbey, at the very place Henry had once defiled, as his corpse rotted in the very air, a dog was licking the blood of a king. There are moments when history bends toward myth, when what should be forgotten instead becomes unforgettable. This was one of those moments. The story of the dog spread like fire through the court. No one knew whether to believe it. No one knew whether they wanted to. But the image remained terrifying, symbolic, prophetic. The king who had broken faith. The king who had defied God. The king who had buried wives and advisors, now being licked by a dog. While his body leaked fluids through cracked lead in the ruins of a church he had destroyed. No one dared move the coffin. Not immediately. They summoned the embalmers. The leak was patched. The base reinforced. Cloths laid down to cover the stains. The dog was removed. Some said it was killed. Others said it vanished. But the damage was done. Not to the corpse. To the legend. Because now, the people whispered not of glory, but of divine vengeance. They no longer feared the king. They pitied him. Or worse, they pitied what he had become. He was no longer Henry VIII, defender of the faith, supreme head of the Church of England, the glorious prince who dazzled Europe. He was a bloated thing in a cracked coffin, a man who even in death could not stop leaking. A man whose rot could not be contained. And this grotesque episode at Sion Abbey was only the beginning, because the king's body would travel on to Windsor Castle, and when it was finally entombed, what lay inside that coffin would not rest peacefully. For years later, when the vault was opened, what they found would only deepen the mystery and confirm the horror. Because Henry's body may not have stopped decaying. It may have exploded. For years after his death, the story of the leaking coffin and the dog that licked the royal fluids drifted through England like a ghost tale. Some whispered it by firelight. Some dismissed it as Catholic vengeance. And others, the older courtiers who had known the man himself, stayed silent. They had seen enough of Henry to know that the line between history and horror had always been thin. But death, as it always does, buried the noise. His body was repaired, resealed, and carried to Windsor Castle, to rest in the quiet chapel of St. George. The procession was solemn, cold, and heavy with irony. The king who once made England tremble now traveled not on horseback, but in a coffin that creaked under his weight. The journey ended 3 weeks after his death. On the 16th of February, in the year 1547, the vault had been prepared beneath the chapel floor, the same resting place as Jane Seymour, the third wife, the quiet one, the only one who had given him a son. The coffin was lowered into the dark. The priests chanted, and the stone was sealed. The ceremony was quick. No great oration. No grand lament. Perhaps the courtiers were tired of mourning. Perhaps they simply wanted to be rid of him. And then, the silence began. For more than a century, no one touched the vault. The Tudor dynasty ended. New kings came and went. England split again and again into Protestant, into Catholic, into something in between. Civil wars tore across the kingdom. Blood ran through the same streets Henry had once paraded upon. And yet, beneath the chapel, his coffin remained, sealed, forgotten, undisturbed, until another king lost his head, in the year 1649. Charles I, the only English monarch ever executed by his own people, was buried hastily after his beheading. His loyalists, desperate to find a safe resting place for his remains, chose the old Tudor vault beneath St. George's Chapel. The vault was opened briefly. Henry's lead coffin visible in the dark. There was little time for ceremony. The beheaded king was placed beside the bloated one, their destinies now entwined in the same pit of royal disgrace. Then, the stone was closed once more, and so it remained for another century and a half until the spring of the year 1813, when builders working in the chapel struck something unexpected beneath the floor. It began with a sound, the dull, hollow ring of a pickaxe hitting metal. They stopped immediately. Arroyaltom, a sealed vault. The discovery spread quickly. Soon the Prince Regent, the future King George IV, arrived, along with several officials and clergymen. On the 1st of April, they gathered at St. George's Chapel to open it formally. What they saw was not the serene image of royal slumber they had imagined. The vault was dark and cramped, its air heavy and sour, even after centuries. The wooden coffins that had once surrounded Henry's were long rotted away, leaving fragments scattered among the debris. But the lead coffin, the one that had held him, was still there, lying lengthwise against the wall, 6 feet 10 inches long, distorted in shape, its surface corroded and buckled, and at the center of it, a gash, a jagged, open wound. The official record described it gently, almost clinically. A considerable opening was observed in the middle, through which the interior could be seen. But those who looked closer understood that this was no simple tear. The lead had not been cleanly cut or pried open by tools. It had been torn apart from within, as though something had pressed against it with unimaginable force. They peered inside. Beneath the collapsed metal, fragments of bone, a skull, the lower jaw still attached, tufts of reddish beard clinging stubbornly to what had once been a chin. The king's remains, scattered, partial, still lying where they had burst free centuries before. Next to him lay the coffin of Jane Seymour. Her coffin was smaller, plain, and intact, the lead sealed tight, unbroken, its shape still clean after nearly 300 years. Not a crack, not a stain. Hers had held, his had not. The men present exchanged uneasy glances. No one said the word aloud, but they all thought it. Explosion. It was the simplest and the strangest explanation. After death, the human body continues to change. Bacteria feed on what remains inside, releasing gases that inflate the corpse like a balloon. In modern times, we know this well. In the 16th century, they did not. They embalmed crudely, imperfectly, often leaving organs behind that continued to rot. In a sealed coffin, especially one made of metal, those gases have nowhere to go. The pressure builds, slowly, invisibly, until one day, it bursts. The historians who later studied the case found the same conclusion. Henry's body had likely ruptured in the weeks after his burial. The leaking at Sion Abbey had been the warning, the first crack in the pressure. By the time he reached Windsor, the decay had continued beneath the herbs, beneath the linens, beneath the layers of lead. And then, quietly, violently, inevitably, the coffin gave way. When the vault was opened again in the year 1888, the damage was even worse. The wooden casing had completely disintegrated. The lead coffin had split wider. An artist named Alfred Young Nutt, serving as the chapel's surveyor, painted a watercolor of what he saw, a twisted mass of gray metal, the lid crushed inward, the sides warped and burst. The image, when viewed even now, seems to breathe. You can almost smell the centuries-old rot. I feel the weight of history pressing outward, as though the king's body had continued its rebellion long after the soul had fled. And what of the others buried beside him? Jane's coffin was still perfect. The seams tight, the surface smooth. The hastily placed coffin of Charles I was likewise intact, though its occupant had entered headless. Only Henry's was desecrated. Only Henry's was torn open, blackened, ruined, as though even the earth itself could not bear to contain him. To the scholars, it was anatomy. To the faithful, it was divine justice. The friar's prophecy had spoken not only of dogs but of disgrace, that Henry's blood would not rest, that his sins would follow him into death. And now, even in the grave, his body had done what his soul had done in life, broken through the bounds meant to hold it. The coffin split, the seal ruptured, the gases of decay, like the fires of retribution, had forced their way into the open. In the centuries that followed, people argued over what the truth really was. Some said the explosion was exaggerated, a myth woven from superstition and hate. Others swore that witnesses in 1813 had understated the horror, that the smell when they opened the vault was overwhelming, that parts of the king's remains had been found scattered far from the coffin itself. But in the end, the details hardly mattered. What mattered was the image, Henry VIII, the magnificent, the terrible. The golden prince who became a tyrant lay destroyed. His coffin burst, his body broken beyond recognition. The man who had executed wives and burned monasteries, who had crowned himself head of the church, who had rewritten the laws of faith and marriage and power, was now nothing more than a stain on the floor of a chapel. There is a certain poetry in that. The body that had once seemed indestructible, the body that had been worshipped, désiré, feared, had proven itself mortal in the most humiliating way imaginable. Not only had death claimed him, decay had mocked him. Time had torn open the casket, meant to preserve him forever. Even now, if you stand in the quiet of St. George's Chapel at Windsor and let your mind drift beneath the stone floor, you might imagine it a dark space, cold and silent, where three kings lie side by side, one headless, one serene, one shattered. And somewhere, in the shadows of that ancient vault, a faint echo of pressure remains, like the memory of breath that once refused to stop. The body of Henry VIII exploded long ago, but the legend never stopped expanding. They sealed the tomb for the last time and walked away. The stone floor of St. George's Chapel swallowed the memory of the man who had once ruled England like a god. No monument marked the grave. No statue. No golden effigy. No carved crown above his head. Just stone, plain and indifferent. Somewhere beneath it, The bloated remains of Henry VIII lay fractured inside a broken coffin, his bones pressed beside the woman who died, bringing him a son, and the king who lost his head trying to keep his throne. A trinity of ruined kings, sleeping side by side in silence. But the story of Henry never stayed buried, because even centuries later, long after his body burst open and his name faded from daily lips, something about him lingered, not as legend, not as glory, but as a caution, something darker, quieter, harder to name, a feeling, more than a fact, the sense that there is a line no man should cross, and that Henry did, again and again, until there was nothing left on the other side. We remember him for the wives. Of course, 6 women who passed through his bed and into history. 2 of them to the block. 2 to divorce. 1 to childbirth death. And 1 the last, who simply outlived him. Their names are taught in rhythm: divorced, beheaded, divorced, beheaded, survived. But that chant, so neat in its rhyme, hides the wreckage underneath. It forgets the cries, the betrayals, the desperate prayers, the final words whispered at the scaffold. It forgets that behind each execution was a man in pain, lashing out at the world, blaming everyone but himself. We remember the break from Rome, the moment Henry declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. Not from belief, but from obsession. From the desire to annul a marriage and have a son, he tore apart centuries of tradition to satisfy a single need. He dissolved monasteries. He burned relics. He scattered nuns and monks like leaves in the wind. All because one pope told him no. Power, once-sized, demands more. And Henry, who had once been the golden prince of peace, became a king of ash and flame. But perhaps most haunting is what he became in the end: a body too large to move, a soul too afraid to rest. A king who killed so many, he could no longer remember their names. A man who trusted no one, who saw treason in every silence, poison in every dish, betrayal in every act of love. He once ruled with charm, then with strength, then with law, and finally, with fear. And that fear outlived him. Even as he lay dying, no one dared speak the truth. To say the king was dying, even as his breath failed, even as his body rotted, was treason. That is the madness. He created a world where truth was dangerous, where facts were flexible, where silence became survival. In the end, no one around him could speak. Even as the king whispered to ghosts, there is something profoundly human in Henry's fall. He was not born monstrous. He was a second son, never meant to rule, a boy who loved music and books, who once wrote poems about love and loss, who dreamed of being a good king. And for a time, he was. The early years of his reign were filled with promise. A Renaissance court, a nation rising, a monarch, generous and bold. But somewhere along the path, the promise broke. Was it the accident in the tilt yard, the blow to the skull that never truly healed? Was it the open wound on his leg that festered for decades and never let him forget the fragility of his own flesh? Was it the deaths of children, the stillbirths, the miscarriages, the haunting failure to produce a living male heir? Or was it something deeper, a flaw in the soul, magnified by the echo chamber of absolute power, whatever the cause? The result is undeniable. Henry VIII lost his humanity piece by piece, and no one could stop him, because when one man holds all power, no one can correct his course. They can only follow or disappear. And yet, for all his might, all his laws, all his executions, he could not escape the end that waits for everyone. His death was not glorious. His burial was not dignified. His body rotted. His coffin cracked. His fluids leaked. A dog licked the floor where his blood had soaked through. His remains burst under the pressure of gases that built inside him like a curse. This was not poetic justice. This was nature, reclaiming what had never truly belonged to kings. There is a strange comfort in that even the most feared monarch, even the most violent tyrant, even the most powerful man of his age was, in the end, made of the same meat and bone as the rest of us. That no crown, no law, no fear can stop the march of time, or the silence of death, or the judgment of memory. And memory, perhaps, is the cruelest judge of all, because we do not remember Henry for his son. Edward died young, his line gone before it began. We do not remember him for glory in battle. He was never truly a warrior king. We do not remember him for peace, or prosperity, or vision. We remember him for what he destroyed, for who he left behind, for the wives who lost their heads, for the friend he sentenced to die, for the church he broke, for the stench that followed him through the palace halls. And that is the legacy of unchecked power. Not the monuments, not the titles, but the echoes, the silence after, the stories told in whispers. Henry VIII teaches us not with sermons, not with decrees, but with decay. That power without mercy becomes cruelty. That greatness without humility becomes ruin. That pain, when unhealed, spreads far beyond the flesh. He did not leave a legacy of love. He left a wound. But wounds can teach. Scars can warn. And in the dark silence beneath St. George's Chapel, where his shattered coffin still lies, perhaps the greatest lesson is waiting quiet, unspoken, but always pulsing just beneath the stone. Even kings rot, and how you use your power when you're alive is the only thing that doesn't